Hi, welcome back to the Journey of Grief, Becoming Us Without Them. I'm Barbara Field, a licensed marriage and family therapist. And today I've invited Maurice Geddes to be with me, who's going to talk to us about grief and athletes. He has experience working with athletes at all levels, including being an athlete. And so I've asked him to help us understand more about how grief is or isn't handled in that world. So Maurice, how about if you take it from here?
Well, hello, Barbara, and thanks again for having me in on your forum. This is an I'm extremely honored that you thought of me or think of me in this light to participate on this platform. And as I've thought about the topic of grief, and especially where it comes to our athletes, there's a number of things that really come to mind. I mean, before we started recording today, I was telling you the story about me being a freshman in high school and how my dad made sure that the seniors that he knew on campus made sure that I wasn't going to slip through the cracks anywhere. So one day after school, they cornered me and said, "You better get in the weight room because you haven't been going." And this was after practice. I wanted to go home. And one day they cornered me and drugged me to the weight room and developed a program for me. And whew, on one side, I felt like, why are they singling me out? And on the other side, my teammates were getting jealous because I was getting all this attention from senior classmen. So yeah, it was interesting that climb to my athletic success when I was young. Yeah, it was interesting. So
So tell us a little bit about you. Give us your background and how you got here right now.
how I got here. Well, Barbara, if we told the in-depth story, I would say a lot of that had to do with you, inviting me into uh, yeah, just professional connections. And I would say most of my life, it seemed like life was destined to do something of this nature, that there was a purpose and a passion to this. As a kid growing up with both my parents, my dad, you know, gave us the strong option of playing sports. And my mom was very supportive of that. And as we got older, my dad got even more involved in our activities, especially with my younger brothers. So as I matured and progressed, I found myself playing at a UC Davis, playing on television. I had a couple of teammates go pro, and I had some pro tryouts myself. And life happened. I mean, it was one of the big disappointments of life. I didn't make it. I didn't get to sign on the pro level. Um, Yet I knew that that was always a plan B. My plan A was to get an education, and I did. Um, Football provided that vehicle for me, and I understood that. So life was not over when I didn't make it signing in the NFL. So life happened, got through college. I obtained a master's degree in criminal justice that aligned with the career that I was in at the time. And then I'd say there was greater influences than myself that reached out to me and encouraged me to come to Western Seminary to get another master's degree, which I didn't see on the forefront. And yet I did that, and life happened then. And as I was doing that and completing that, I had a teammate from college approach me, and he encouraged me to work with his athletes. He was the head coach at the time, Dan Hawkins of the UC Davis Aggies. And I knew right at that moment what I was supposed to be doing. So 2018, I got into a PhD program with Grand Canyon University, and the rest just kind of evolved from there. Yeah.
So you're working on your PhD, and so what is that going to be about?
Absolutely. I'm in just I'm at the stage of IRB approval. And just got to second level peer review, and I don't expect anybody to understand what that means unless they've gone through the PhD program process. But what that means is I'm very near to doing my research. Not enough is known about how collegiate male athletes describe their holistic wellness. So through a series of research material that I went through, I was able to determine that there was a significant gap in the research that prompted me to pursue this research. So I'm a doctoral candidate at Grand Canyon University in Arizona, and I've been at it for 6.5 years, and I don't plan on going over 7.
Cool. So the topic of grief and athletes, you've worked with athletes at various levels along the way.
Yes.
And I think people don't really talk about, and we were talking about it earlier, is, you know, being an athlete, it's not just something you do, it's something you are.
Mm-hmm.
And your friends are all athletes, your world is athletes, everything circles around your games.
Mm-hmm.
And that's great as long as everything is working and your trajectory is
Mm-hmm.
what you plan for it to be and everything's taking you in the directions you expect it to go. But a lot of athletes have career ending injuries or incidents, and suddenly they go from being a star athlete to nobody. And
Yeah.
as a drug and alcohol counselor, I've treated a lot of people who have crashed right into addiction out of a professional dream. So let's talk about that.
Absolutely. So part of what helps me to understand athletes is that, throughout high school, I excelled in 3 different sports: football, wrestling, and track. Not unusual in football. Um, Wrestling, my senior year, I wound up going to state in wrestling, got really good at that. And then as far as track and field, I progressed from being a shot put thrower to uh, being a relay team, being on the relay team, the second leg of the relay, running a relay. To be a big guy is really, really fast. And I didn't pay a lot of attention to it at first, but by the time I got to college, it was a big deal. So having that understanding and being around other athletes, yeah, you become who you are. And you're defined a lot of times. Your identity centers around you being that athlete, and the ability to perform, um, chasing your dreams, what that looks like or could look like. And then every athlete comes to this, whether they're a pro athlete or not, at some point, they will transition from the sport. And as you mentioned earlier, when you transition or are made to transition from injury, that has a significant impact, not only on how they see themselves, but in their psyche. A lot of athletes, they don't know anything different. Education in college was not the primary focus. Their identity was not based on who they were as a person. Their identity was developed on who they were as an athlete. So you take that identity away, that's a big deal. And I've seen varying degrees of how athletes manage. I know how I managed, but there are a number of athletes who don't manage. They go through periods of depression. They go through identity crisis. Well, I'm not any good at anything else. I'm worthless. And you've heard all of those statements in addictive protocols when people who have fallen into some type of addiction. And so it's not unusual that I'm able to reach a whole lot of athletes, that are experiencing various degrees of depression, anything from, well, I'm not starting, the coaches aren't paying attention to me, to where I've had a career-ending injury. One of my best friends, and I'm sure he doesn't mind me sharing this, Vincent Newsom, who played with the Los Angeles Rams for 10 or 12 seasons and had his last season with the Cleveland Browns, and he had a career-ending neck injury. And he took it in stride, he dealt with it, and he transitioned with the team as they moved up to Baltimore and became uh, part of the managing part of the Baltimore Ravens, and retired just last year as second in command of over player personnel. So in his story, I think because he had so many years of professional experience, he was able to kind of find a smooth landing within the organization. Well, that doesn't happen for all athletes. Um, I I was reading this book not too long ago. It was called Above the Noise by DeMar DeRozan. DeMar is a basketball player in the NBA, and he talks about first growing up in Compton, California, and then his experiences as he went on to play pro ball. And some of the lowest points in his life, not initially addressing that he was battling depression, but a lot of times those athletes are traded from one team to the next. In this one particular trade, he just was not hearing it. And that's really where he had to get a handle on his depression. The fact that he braved the environment to talk about it was a big deal. So there's a huge stigma amongst male athletes, especially, that you just don't talk about your feelings, and you definitely don't talk about your mental health. There's a perception of you will be perceived as weak, and no one wants to be perceived that way. However, it couldn't be further from the truth.
Yeah, so when we're talking to grieving clients, we remind them that your ability to access a social support system is going to drastically influence how you manage that.
Mm-hmm.
Often, so my son was a soccer player, and his value that when he was doing great, he was great. And when he wasn't doing great, he was a ghost. So when
Mm-hmm.
all your relationships are based on your performance and the people on your team, some of them are kind of wishing they had your place on the team. Those are not exactly what you call deep, abiding connections to safe human beings. And often when an athlete is injured and loses their sport, their friends don't know how to manage that. So they don't show.
Absolutely.
And so they find themselves with no social support, which
Mm-hmm.
really intensifies the grief and prolongs the period during which they make space for another version of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So talk about that culture of really think about just an individual has that career ending injury and what did they typically expect and what are some athletes that you know of that actually had better social support and possibly were able
Mm-hmm.
to thrive a little sooner?
Mm-hmm. Well, most athletes on all levels, they don't prepare for injury. There's no practice you go to and you talk about being injured. Um, so therefore, when it happens, sometimes you almost feel like you're a person that's cast away on an island somewhere until you can be reintroduced back into the fold. Um, you've heard of the product Gatorade. So Gatorade was a product that was introduced um, because coaches were concerned about the physical well-being of their athletes. And it was interesting that it is now a staple on football field, basketball court, baseball diamond, anywhere you go, Gatorade is a mainstay because of the level of attention that avoiding injury that it mattered. So just that alone. So when you look at how important it is to maintain your health, maintain your status as an athlete, there's a huge amount of pressure that goes into that. Um, I talk with my athletes a lot of times. They're not even familiar a lot of times with what grief is. So I spend a lot of time speaking with the athletes that are injured. I'm like, your guys' mental strength right now is going to be the pulse in the heart of your team as they see you start to recover and how you are managing your injury. That's going to lend confidence to those who are out there. I know that's not something you want to hear, but it's really important externally that you at least have an understanding of that. Now, what's most important is not the external things that are going on, it's the internal things that are going on with you. One, recognizing that you're going to be going through a grief process, which is understandable. Um, in the athletic world, it's really tough to get the support on a daily level after you've been injured. So now that we are in a level where, we have the prolific athlete, there's a whole lot of money devoted to athletic health. And within the last 10 years, 15 years even, there's been a lot more attention to athlete mental health. And that was one of the key factors for me when I came across the research article for my PhD work, talked about the mental health of female athletes. And I said, well, I started looking, I'm like, okay, what do they say about male athletes, the mental health of males? And Barbara, there was hardly no information there. So what I get to do now is I get to explore an area of mental health and an area within athletes that has not really been addressed a whole lot.
And why do you think that is? Is it part of that culture of we're fine and we don't want to talk about it?
Yes, there's a huge stigma, and I'm not speaking anecdotally. Research indicates that there's a huge stigma amongst male athletes to not speak about their mental illness or mental health. To do so and as I mentioned earlier, to say that, well, I must be weak if I'm having to deal with mental health issues. Word is quite the opposite, quite contrary. It is the strength of the athlete to say, you know what, I have to look at myself introspectively and I have to address whatever the issue that is going on with me. I'm better off as a whole, as a holistically whole person to address this part of me. And as those who are able to do that transition back into the mainstream very quickly, whether they're injured or transitioning from a sport, going into the real world. A lot of professional athletes have a hard time um, reinventing themselves after football is over. And you got college athletes who don't make it playing pro. There's a level of transition that, and I experienced that as well. There was some depression. I couldn't watch football for at least 3 years because every attempt that I made, I'd see players that I played against that they were playing pro ball and they weren't as good as me. And I'm like, how did that happen? So there's a whole process of how do you think about yourself, what your value, what your self-worth is. And then you have to come to some conclusions about your own self-worth. And when you're having a hard time with that, who do you talk to?
Right.
Do you go to the
It's like when you have barely any support when it's working, the support when it's over, when it's not working, when it's broken, who did they talk to? Like I went to widow support groups when my husband died. There's parent support groups for losing a child, but is there any sense in which somebody says, these athletes need some help?
Yeah, unfortunately, one of the statistics that I came up against is that there is a higher suicide rate amongst college athletes than there is against the rest of the college population. So when you weigh per capita the college population, how huge it is, and you have this smaller community of athletes, and their suicide rate is higher, that's pretty significant. So a lot of times I always share with my athletes and tell them I wish I had somebody like me to talk to when I was their age or when I was playing ball back in the day. Um, those resources weren't available, made available. And as they have come to be more available, the stigma still creates a boundary from athletes actually going and seeking that support out.
That's too bad. So what's on the horizon? Who's doing what to make
I,
it
I
okay
think
for
there's,
athletes to get
yeah,
help?
I think there's a lot on the horizon. I get to speak to a lot of pro scouts that come around the college players, and a lot of the pro scouts are indicating that there's a lot more attention within each organization to have some type of sports psychologist, to have some type of support system for the athletes. There's no um, there's no they can't be forced to seek that support out, but the resources are there and made available. Um, it'd be great one day when all athletes seek that support out for themselves. Um, it's amazing that when I've worked with some of my athletes, how much insight they gain from the experience, because we're not just talking about sports, we're now talking about them as a person. And when you start to personalize their experience and really lend an ear to what their experience is, they feel safe and they feel comfortable and they feel like that you really care about them. And that's a vulnerable place to be. And those who are transparent in those places, I cherish those environments where that transfer of communication and level of collaborative work can really make a difference. There's a huge trust factor, and those who are in the profession that I am, and those who are embarking into that area of supporting athletes in their mental wellness. Trust is probably one of the hugest factors involved in developing that rapport.
Yeah. So they, kind of the big thing for people to talk about in therapy these days is attachment styles.
Hmm.
So if you have a secure attachment style, then you just kind of sprung. When you hit the ground, you bounce. And you have this belief that people are glad to be with you, whatever version you are, and then you have all the resources you need to handle what life brings you, and therefore you can thrive and grow. And so you can see why they say that if you put two people into the same situation, one gets PTSD and one doesn't. The one who doesn't is that person with a secure attachment whose view of themselves and the world and what they can expect from the future isn't shifted by outside things so much. But
Hmm.
someone who has that insecure attachment and doesn't feel valued and worthy from the get go, doesn't believe people can accept all the versions of themselves with equal generosity, therefore doesn't see that they have any resources, and they can't even imagine that the terrible things that happen to them are going to teach them anything, they tend to crash and burn. So whether it's athletics or anything else, we're
Hmm.
finding that those people who have that internal strength,
Hmm.
it's universal. And the people that
Yes.
have that, the house they've built is on a shaky foundation, those tend to crumble. And athletics is one of the places where we see that. So when I'm seeing the stories of all the athletes, the movie stars, everyone who falls apart, my orientation towards attachment is now that is a deeply, deeply lonely human being who
Mm-hmm.
doesn't know how to get what they need to fill that hole. And so they're coming up with some really bad ideas. So talk
So
about athletes and attachment.
absolutely. So, attachment theory doesn't know the athlete from, from the librarian. Attachment theory is attachment theory. The misnomer is um, there's more secure attachment in the world than non-secure attachment. I don't know that to be true. What I find is every athlete, every client that I've ever worked with has some varying degree of challenge in their attachments. There's no such thing as the perfect attachment or secure. I don't even know why they say that. I think sometimes a secure attachment can be fleeting. However, there are those, as you've mentioned, those people who seem to be able to navigate life. There's a resilience, there's a resourcefulness, there's some insight, there's faith. There's something inside of them that says, I'm going to be able to get through this. Sometimes it has to do with their families of origin, how they were raised, the attention that was given to their stages of development. So when you start to talk about attachment theory, taking the athletic experience away, that person is still a human, right? So when I see athletes not thriving in their athletic environments, that's one of the places that I go. I get to explore their families of origin. I get to get a better understanding of how they see themselves holistically. And I'm going to say that word a whole lot, um, but how they see themselves holistically is important. Just like you say, if your whole life is deemed your identity is deemed based on what you do on the football field, and you're no longer playing football, by reason, what then should you identify yourself with?
Right.
So I was raised in an environment where I was identified as Maurice Geddes, the person, the man first. It's just how my parents raised me. It wasn't about football or wrestling or track accolades. It was learning how to be the best version of yourself no matter where you were. So one of the cornerstones of my practice has always been, to work with clients who want to be the best version of themselves, being a better version of yourself today than you were yesterday. So there's a segue in any avenue of with anybody that I'm working with. It seems to work really well.
That's great. And hopefully that can become more of the way that people work with athletes. Because I know my son was just treated like a racehorse. He was like favored and got, you know, was babied and pampered, even though we were trying really hard to develop him into a whole person. His coaches were just trying to develop him into a soccer star so he could win
Mhm.
them games. And it was quite a battle. And I told you when his athletics kind of hit its dead end, my youngest son said, well, I used to be really jealous that my brother was such a natural athlete and I was just a regular dude. But now I realize I came out ahead because I arrived at adulthood with a personality and he still got to go get one. So
Very,
that was a
it's fun.
snarky little brother thing to say, but it was really true watching him learn how to be himself
Hmm.
without
Hmm.
his shirt.
Yeah, that identity, I mean, you can speak to that in any discipline or genre of, of life. Um, Not to go too far off the beaten path, but over the years I've been learning to play the bass guitar. It's performance based, right? Ph.D. is performance based. And so I was studying Jaco Pastorius. He was an incredible bass player. He was not on this earth for a very long time, but in the short period that he left an indelible mark on the world of bass playing. In one of his books that I was reading, um, his brother cited this. His mom wouldn't let him wash or excused him from washing any dishes so that he wouldn't cut his hands. And his brothers just hated him for that his mom was giving him that preferential treatment because of his craft. So here he is, a 15, 16-year-old kid, and his mom's telling his younger siblings, no, he doesn't have to wash dishes because I don't want him to mess up his hands. So yeah, preferential treatment is a big thing, and we see it in sports all the time. And those athletes who receive that preferential treatment, some of them don't know how to handle it. In fact, many of them don't know how to handle it because they expect that this is how it's supposed to be. I know that as I started to experience some of that, I was always reminded of my own humility. So I never got to be so cocky or arrogant to where I wasn't humble to the people around me, whether it was other athletes or just people that I was around on a daily basis. And something you said earlier, I just want to interject this real quick. You talked about coaches and having somebody to communicate with. And one of the things that I've learned is there's really two main types of leaders. There are transactional leaders where you scratch your back, I'll scratch yours. And then there are transformational leaders to where they have a pulse on their followers. They have a pulse on their athletes. They engage in such a way where they are empowering and encouraging. They engage in such a way where the athletes buy into what's being said, buy into the agenda. We have to play ball. I mean, I was just looking at the Oklahoma Thunder basketball team who just won the championship. And they very much have a culture, a team culture of buying into the belief system of the organization and buying into the belief system of each other. Makes all the difference in the world. How you approach the game, how you approach the other, and how you approach others, and then how you feel and think about yourself. So those are the significant keys in um, dealing with grief in sports.
That's kind of who you are before the bad thing happens that affects a lot of kinds of grief and
Absolutely.
the progression back into some form of, okay, I can do this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, is there any last thing that you want to leave us with, any wisdom for grieving athletes and how to support athletes who are grieving various losses? And
Absolutely. One of the things I always encourage athletes is to seek out support, someone that they can trust to talk to. Not everybody's equipped to handle your burdens. We know that. So if there's somebody in your life, whether it's a family member or a friend or a professional like myself, seek that person out and seek to gain some insights into where your strengths are. We all have strengths. Sometimes we just aren't aware of what they are. A lot of things that have helped me throughout my lifetime in sports, so on and so forth, is having those people in my life that I trusted to be able to offer some wise counsel. So that was huge. The other thing is you can't put a time limit on your recovery. You can't hurry it along. There's no shortcuts. As I say, you look for shortcuts and you'll always be shorted. So there's no shortcut in your recovery. The other thing is to take one step at a time. There's no sense and rationale in looking at the 10th step if we haven't mastered the first one. So I always try to encourage my athletes and in my clients, teaching them about the grief process, kind of some of the things of what to expect, because a lot of people don't know. To be able to identify where they're at in those processes and to offer themselves the compassion that they will offer someone else.
that's great.
Yeah.
Well, okay. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise. And I know I will see you around later. And it's
Absolutely.
great spending this time with you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Barbara. Take care.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.